Hi, my name is Carmen, and welcome to Tomes and Textiles. As always, for my opening credits, I want to thank my Lectores members. That's Orten, Libri Labra, Lydia Jackson, Princess Peachy, and Val Your Mortgage Gal. Thanks so much to my Lectores members for supporting me on Bindery. If you would like to do so, you can check out my Bindery link down below. After hearing the news of Renee Good's murder and watching the government trying to cover up in real time, it feels really weird to sit here and tell you that I'm going to be reviewing two books. But I have been on a history kick, in particularly a U.S. history kick lately. I feel these two books put a lot of things that people may be having new emotions about into perspective, especially in light of U.S. history, in particular how the United States and the government has treated Indigenous peoples. Today I'm going to be doing two book reviews of two Indigenous histories I read at the end of 2025. The first history is The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk. The subtitle of this book is Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History. This book is a perspective shift of U.S. history, and I learned so incredibly much just by turning the lens to an Indigenous lens. I feel like I have read a lot of Black history and knew a lot of history from that perspective. But as we know, history is not a series of dates and names and events. It's actually who gets to tell the story. So hearing from an Indigenous perspective is different from hearing history from a Black perspective. And I have to say that Ned's research is unmatched. This book is giant. It's like a textbook. It took me about 6 weeks to get through this, and I don't think that I absorbed everything. I would love to take a class with Ned in order to really dig deep into U.S. history, and it was such a wonderful surprise when I tuned in to Ken Burns' American Revolution, because Ned is actually one of the historians that was consulted for that series. I have about 20 pages of notes in my Moleskine, and I don't know that I can get through all of this and like properly express how extremely frustrating it was to hear the level of detail of how Indigenous peoples have been wronged by the United States, and even in like pre-colonial times. It has been this whole notion of settler colonialism just encroaching and murdering and killing and making excuses for doing that. So when I saw the news of Renee Good's murder, I immediately went to these books because you have a government that, since its inception, not only pushed aside Indigenous peoples, but they have made excuses and made room for settlers and pushed Indigenous peoples out of the way, to the point of murder and genocide, and to the point of manipulating the legal system in order to gain an advantage. And not to sound like I am resigned to the system remaining as it is, it's just that, to me, ICE and this escalation to this violence now towards white women, it has been inevitable in the last year, but also throughout my entire life. You have seen the escalation and how different marginalized groups are targeted by the government and marginalized and murdered, and no real change comes forth, and then further violence. And so to see it in Indigenous history, and something that we're very rarely taught to this level, that was both eye-opening and also has made me a little bit numb to current events insofar as being surprised or shocked or saying this isn't the country that I know, because it is the country by design. This is the country. This government is now in this hyper-capitalistic situation, and everyone that stands in its way is this government's an enemy. I think what I'm going to do for The Rediscovery of America is that I'm just going to kind of read and talk about some of my favorite quotes from the book. The first one is, Borderlands history invites to take a deeper look at past failures because failures tell stories that unmake national histories. So To me, this was coming at a time where the Department of Homeland Security is putting out all of these Manifest Destiny paintings on their social media, and how they are at the same time trying to ban books, change school curriculums. Histories like The Rediscovery of America completely negate this propaganda that the government is trying to put forth in order to, one, subvert the truth, but two, to build itself up to this mythical level that this government protects freedom. There's a lot of discussion of land acquisition because clearly the settler colonial state moved westward. And there's this quote because he's talking about how Congress actually becomes the strongest arm of the United States government for a time. Alienated land from native peoples, masters of this island, dispossesses indigenous peoples of their lands. Congress and the United States power through Articles of Confederation over regulating Indian trade. So there is also, like, when I talked about capitalism, this also touches on that and how indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their trades even in order for white men to build these giant fortunes off of what indigenous peoples were doing by pushing them off their land. Black Hawk also talks a lot about empire, and one of the quotes is, "Empire by definition is imperial and unequal, and nations like empires create history that seek to glorify their existence and expansion." Again, going into the history that is created by the government, these mythologies, in order to perpetuate the harm that they're doing while giving themselves this culpable deniability of what their actions truly are. He also speaks frankly about how indigenous peoples dispossessed of their lands were deported from their lands. So mass deportations from their land. And this is something that, again, this slight perspective change, but again, the Monroe Doctrine is coming up this week because of Venezuela, and this book also dips very deeply into Monroe Doctrine. He talks about indigenous labor, power, and resistance indelibly shaped the formation of colonial and national authority. So, and he talks about it from the perspective of the Monroe Doctrine. And even Lewis and Clark and their storied journey throughout, he details out all the different tribes that assisted them with their whole journey, and he says, "Rarely has a federally sanctioned expedition proven so reliant on indigenous knowledge, power, and hospitality." They received all the power for, mapping out the United States when it was already mapped, and like never do you hear of the tribes and like what they contributed to them making it through this journey. And just going back to the Monroe Doctrine, he calls it a declaration of war against America's indigenous nations. Black Hawk also hones in on the violence of this dispossession and the myriad of ways that it accomplished. And one of the ways specifically is in disease, and how death and disease of indigenous peoples is outside the register of U.S. history. So he always talks about what's included in the history, and then he expands it out to what has false accident, whether that be by accident or intent. After the Civil War, he talks quite a bit about plenary powers, which we heard Stephen Miller accidentally use that terminology recently. This is when the colonial power consolidates their power over indigenous peoples, and we witnessed a commensurate rise in the power of the federal government to assert its authority over Western citizens, lands, and native peoples. We also talked quite a bit about the seizure of children and putting them into schools, setting up the Office of Indian Affairs and the United States control of it, like literally using it as its own arm to accomplish its goals rather than actually assisting indigenous peoples. And then the violation of treaties time and time again. It's just absolutely incredible how they found ways to subvert the rule of law that was laid in place and part of the Constitution for this government's furthering of its expansion. The book rounds out in the early 20th century, and he actually talks about how the Germans committed genocide in Africa, and they actually looked to the United States as the model for what they did there. The quote is, "Look at America, the native must give way." The text of the work is 445 pages, but with the notes and index, this book is 596 pages. So there is a plethora of research that he has provided for us if you want to read even further into detail or find the source documents that he used. This is an incredible work of nonfiction. It is worth your time, and it's more relevant, in my opinion, now more than ever in the United States. I followed up Rediscovery of America with By the Fire We Carry by Rebecca Nagel. Again, another Indigenous nonfiction work. The subtitle of this one is The Generations Long Fight for Justice on Native Land. And what this book focused on is Oklahoma and a murder that took place there in 1999. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and what Rebecca does is this legal perspective work of how we got to this particular court case and how this court case made it all the way up to the steps of the Supreme Court. If there's one quote from this book that I would take away from it, it's, "The fight over truth is so bitter because power flows from the dominant narrative." So we always hear that, the winner is the one that writes the history, and this is a book that is steeped in that, but it's also steeped in legal analysis. There was rarely a time in this book that I did not turn the page and scream like, "Oh my God," or "What the fuck?" And I think it was paired with the fact that I had just finished Rediscovery of America. To see legally what the United States was doing and how they would usurp the rule of law in order to make room for the settlers and to dispossess and displace indigenous peoples is something that it should be studied. This book should be on every single United States person's TBR, and we should all be reading this, because if you're screaming, "Oh my God, Trump and this administration is not following the rule of law," well, literally in this book, Andrew Jackson, my new nemesis, he defies the Supreme Court, and nothing is done because the Supreme Court doesn't have a police. No one's going to get arrested. And this book really amplifies the fact that democracy, quote unquote, is this trust system, and they have betrayed indigenous peoples time and time again, and it's the privileged few of us who are maybe sitting here going, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that they've done this. Where's the rule of law in 2025? Where they've been doing it since the start to indigenous peoples. This book really does show how the pillars of democracy have already been eroded. So again, another book that shifts your perspective of how you are maybe feeling about things right now, because for indigenous peoples, many of the things that many of us took for granted for a long time simply did not exist. There's a quote, "People say you can't judge history by today's standards, but there is no need. It is not possible to judge removal more harshly than the activists of 1830 did." So from 1830, we're talking about the United States no longer being a beacon of society. And through discussions of allotment, through discussions of removal, through discussions of termination, it is underscored time and time again in this book that there is no rule of law for indigenous peoples. They are subjects of the United States government and at the whim. To the point where the United States government created an entire legal framework with which to seize indigenous land and then didn't even follow its own rules. There's not just the extraction of land and passing it off to other people to build their generational wealth and leaving indigenous peoples poverty-stricken. There's also where indigenous peoples are inheriting land and they're still creating laws and rules in order to strip them of their sovereignty over the land, in order to strip the land of its natural resources and extract the wealth and leave indigenous peoples with nothing. There was this whole thing with oil wells that need to be cleaned up in Oklahoma, and the fact that these companies were able to take all the oil and leave like this barren wasteland that is an environmental disaster and then not even have to clean it up. It's just, I've just been so mad since I read these books a couple months ago that, again, I'm hurt and I'm surprised and like my eyes are dry because I am crying all the time. But to see the depth and the depravity of this government in the current day, it is operating as it's designed, and our tax dollars have been funding this, are funding this, and it's no different now than it was 250 years ago. Criminals with no punishment, and we're funding it. I don't know that this is so much a review, but a rant, and I appreciate you listening to me and being here today. I highly recommend both The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk and By the Fire We Carry by Rebecca Nagel. I have them both linked down below. And as always, my closing credits are to thank my Libritos members: Alma, Angel Soul, Angie, and Eliza, Christina Vorkos, Between Naps and Novels, Book Nerd Buzz Erica, Celeste, Conchas y Cuentos Corazon, Denise, EBS, Grace Santa Maria, Hialeah, Hey Larita, I Am Bumble, J454, Jackals, Jenny, Just Joe, Katie, Kelly MC, Kingrid, KMC84, La Marie Reads, Libros Means Books, Lisetto86, No Life But Books, OMG Nancita, PM Marshall, R. Van Stratton, Sandra Espinoza Lopez, Sarah's Bookish Macaroons, Sawyer Cole, Sharda, Sol del Mar, Sonia Zavala, Stephanite, Susie Stephanie, Tamara Thoner, Thoran Reads, Twisted Apples, Vanessa Lilac, Vicky, Glorious, Mimi Rivas, Stephanie Nina. Thank you all so much for supporting me, and if you want to join my Bienvenidos Bindery, I have it linked down below. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'll see you next time.